Welcome, everybody, to this masterclass. My name's Andy Bruff. I'm part of the faculty of Country Navigator, talking to you my time this afternoon from South Africa, and a real privilege to be with you for the next 59 minutes as we talk about this fascinating topic, reading between the lines. This idea that communication is not always clearly understood, and that as you work across culture, there are many opportunities for misunderstanding, for ambiguity, and confusion. But before we get into that, let's start with a good example of how things can be misinterpreted. So we're going to put a poll up, and I'm going to ask you to tell me if you were to see the following words: quite good. A piece of work is referred to as quite good. What does that mean? And we've given you 4 answers there. Please vote for me now, and then we'll see what your thoughts are about this idea of something being referred to as, quote, quite good. I see we've got almost 50 of you in the room, so welcome if you've just joined us. This is our masterclass on reading between the lines, and we're jumping straight into a poll where we're asking you to give us your thoughts on this somewhat misinterpreted statement, or certainly the possibility for misinterpretation is there when you read something as being quite good. So we're up to about 80% participation. I'll give you another few seconds, and then I'll share the results with you and we'll get into the content. Welcome. It's great to have you with us. All right, so I'm going to end the poll in the next 5 seconds. If you haven't voted yet, please do so, and then we'll share the results with you. Of course, as people are coming in, the percentage of completion rate is actually going down. So I can see we've had a couple more people join us. We're up to now 66, 67 of you in the room. So let's extend that opportunity for you to vote. Welcome if you've just joined us. And we've started straight away with our session on reading between the lines by asking you to complete this poll. When you hear somebody say, this is quite good, or you read feedback that you've done something that is, quote, quite good, what does that mean to you? Okay, I'm going to give you another few seconds. All right, let's stop that now, and then I'm going to share the results with you. And you can see that people's perceptions are pretty broad and diverse. We've got just less than half of you saying quite good would mean excellent. We've got the similar percentage of you saying quite good means average. And then I've got 2% of you saying, well, actually one person saying that would be interpreted as really bad. And then 3 or 4 of you saying, well, you see it possibly as something else. And of course, this is exactly the point, that sometimes we say things, we refer to things, we hear things that can be misinterpreted. Now, I'm going to press you a little more on some examples of phrases or expressions that when you hear them in English could mean something else, maybe in your cultural context. So Luke is going to put up a link for us. If you've not been on one of our masterclasses before, we use a virtual whiteboard called Mural, and the link for that will come up in chat. You can simply click on that link. You don't need to register. There is an option for you to enter as a visitor. And when you do that, it will take you straight into the room. So click on that link. And when you get in there, we will see that you are nominated an animal. So there's some anonymity there. We've got seahorses and lions and bees and pandas. And then we're going to ask you to think about some examples. So just want to confirm, Luke, that this is actually not the correct link. Or sorry, the one, there we go. That's the one that I'm looking for. So examples where an expression or a phrase have different meanings in different cultures. So to complete this, you will need to hover on the sticky note and then double click to be able to type. So what we're looking for are examples of an expression or a phrase that when you hear it, maybe English is not your first language, or you know that even between, say, the US and the UK, there may be a difference in interpretation. Can you think of an example of a phrase or an expression that has different meanings in different cultures. Just hover over the sticky note, double click it, and you should be able to type your answer. And again, this, I think, talks to what we said earlier about hearing something being quite good. So we've got people typing. I'm going to wait for you. There are some great examples that will come through, I'm sure. And then I may share a couple of my own as well. But let me give you an opportunity now to work here on our virtual whiteboard. And if you're in, then you should be able to just hover over the sticky note and give us your answers. Expressions or phrases that might have different meanings in different cultures. Please go ahead. And of course, I would ask that we keep them PG rated. I know that my brain went to a couple that I thought those certainly won't be suitable for a masterclass. So think about examples that you can share with no hesitation. Right, so I can see 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15, 16 that have come through. Kavita, feel free to type into the virtual room, or if you're not able to, you can put it into chat as well. But that's great. Okay, so what I'm seeing are some really interesting examples. I'm not going to read them all out. I'm sorry, not bad. You're doing a fine job. I'm fine. It's fine. Not bad. Bless your heart. Can you look into this? I'll be there in 5 minutes. That's a classic one. This is interesting. Lots of different interpretations around that. I'm sorry. I'm not as good. Excuse me. That's okay. Very interesting. Somebody else has put that down. The reaction or comment usually has different meanings based in culture. Absolutely. Two that come to mind, which I think build on what George is saying about the importance of the non-verbal, the tone, the voice, and the gesture. So non-verbal, I remember going to Ethiopia the first time and sitting in a restaurant and was surprised as I sat at the table and the person I was with was clapping loudly for the waiter. That was something that I was not familiar with and hadn't seen that as a gesture or a way of getting somebody's attention. In fact, in my part of the world, that would have been regarded as downright rude. So that's not an expression, but certainly a gesture, to George's point. The other one this week, I'm busy working on another book, and my co-author is based in the US. I've told you I'm based in South Africa, and we were talking about this notion of handoff. So in the one sense, this notion of handing off a piece of work to somebody else, giving them the responsibility, the autonomy to complete that piece of work. It's a very positive connotation, but I'm a big rugby supporter, and we talk about a handoff being a face, an arm in the face. It's a way of defending yourself from a tackle. So it has a negative connotation very often. You wouldn't want to be giving somebody a handoff in the office. So I think these are just some great examples, along with the ones that you've put down here, of how you can hear something in one context and it can be interpreted in a completely different one. I note the Australian phrase there and others, which I think is very, very powerful. So thank you for that. And that's really what we're trying to get in today is if you're developing your cultural intelligence as a leader, how do you learn to quote unquote read between the lines? And so let's come out of that, Luke, and go to our next slide. And in this slide, what I want you to see is this idea of really understanding something of how we work together when it comes to these slides. So we're going to get out of that one, Luke, if we can, and just go to the presentation. Are we there? Yes, we are. Good. Okay, so in this slide, what we're talking about here is, let me just get back to the slide that I want. Can we just go to slide 2, Luke? Okay, so that's the quite good piece. And then we can go to slide 3. Thank you. All right, so what we've got here is a couple of important principles for you to understand. The first is this idea that your message is always going to be filtered through context and culture. When you hear one of these messages, these examples that you've given us in the mural, what I may be intending to transmit in terms of meaning and in terms of understanding is not necessarily what you understand, because the context that you're in and the culture that you are receiving the message through, that lens is going to shape how this communication message is received. And so we know from communication theory that there is the sender, there is the receiver, there is the channel. And what I really like about the model that you see on the left is this understanding that even if you are face to face with somebody, so no barriers in terms of technology, clear communication, no noise distractions, there can still be misunderstanding because of a misinterpretation, either from a contextual level or from a cultural level. And what you see on the right-hand side is one of the dimensions that we have in our world prism profile. So we have 9 dimensions, and the first one has to do with how we relate to each other. I won't get into all of the others today, but suffice to say that the one that you're seeing on the screen is a continuum where all of us are going to be either more or less explicit or implicit in our communication. So full disclosure, when I completed my World Prism profile some 17 years ago, I was surprised to see that I come out about as far left as you could get. I'm highly explicit. Also, just to say that George makes the point that there should be a slice of culture before the context as well as after. And I think that's a very good point, George. So I'm highly explicit. When I communicate, I want to be clear that you know what I mean, that I say what I mean, and I mean what I say. And I would be regarded within my own family and my own culture as somebody who is relatively direct in the way that I communicate. That's not necessarily true of everybody from the country that I was born in. And we know that we have to resist these temptations to stereotype people according to nationality. But we do know that the data shows us that there are tendencies for people to be more or less explicit. And certainly as you move to the right on that continuum, what you find is that meaning is more inferred, meaning is more contextual. You have to be able to read between the lines. And I remember talking to a colleague of mine who was born in Eastern China, explaining to me that in many cases, the sentence would be unfinished, and the recipient of that message would be able to kind of, join the dots and have no problem in picking up on the intended meaning and on the innuendo and on the subtlety. We'll get into the dynamics of the implicit and explicit later. But the first thing I want to ask you is, as Luke puts a question into chat, you will get a report, and you want to know whether that report is actually going to be received on a particular day. So is the report going to be received on a Friday is the important part. If you're in explicit or implicit communication, what does that mean? Is the person going to get a report on Friday? Well, there's a question. And George makes the point that he chooses what his identity or role is. He chooses to expose that or divorce that from how he sees understanding the demands of the context. I think that's very helpful. So there we go. Are we going to get the report on Friday? And I think the question is, are you an implicit or explicit communicator? So let's think about that. Maybe we jot that down as well, Luke. You ask for something, and the response is, I'll see, or I'll look about it, I'll think about it. What does that mean? And are you more implicit or explicit? Of course, if you've done the Country Navigator profile, you will have more data to back up your answer there and to be able to give yourself some insight as to where you fall on that continuum. I think what's important, though, is to think about where you might be in terms of perception. How does explicit perceive implicit? How does implicit perceive explicit and vice versa? So as you're thinking about that question, both rhetorically and practically, in terms of where you fall on the continuum of communication, let's go into a second link. This is the one that actually came up in error in just a moment. Some of you may have answered that. And it's this notion of the implicit versus explicit dimension. So let's go in there and let's have a look. I'm just clicking on mine to see. And there we go. So if you're an implicit communicator, how do you perceive explicit communicators? So you would give us some answers on the left-hand side. And if you're an explicit communicator, how do you perceive the implicit communicators? So it's the inverse. So again, I'm going to ask you to just type into chat your thoughts. This is about perception, and I'll show you what our data is giving us as far as insights and thoughts around this, as we've asked this question of many, many people around the world. Again, we want to think about stereotypes. We want to make sure we're not reinforcing those. And George makes the point that this would be contextual. It would be dependent on the topic or the issue or on the relationship. And George, that's absolutely correct. However, what we see is that there are underlying tendencies that in the grand scheme of things, we tend to be more or less one or the other, depending on the context. And I think that's the important part, is then once you know that, is being able to adapt. And so what you're saying, George, is already illustrates a higher level of understanding in terms of being able to contextualize your message. Okay, so lots of typing going on here. Again, you will have been allocated an animal rather than your first name. And what I'm going to ask is, Luke, if we can just zoom in on the left first, and let's see if we can pick up a couple of those and see what's coming through. So if I'm an implicit communicator, how am I perceived? That's the first question on the left. I'm an implicit communicator, and how am I perceived? How do I perceive the explicit ones? So this is implicit perceiving explicit, and you will see that people have got, keywords. Let's do some qualitative coding here, and you'll see that there's impolite, there's pushy, there's rude, there's overbearing, there's intense, there's patronizing, there's unflexible, there's bossy, there's sometimes aggressive, there's straight, there's direct, and there's clear. So it's interesting that most of those have pretty negative connotations. And of course, when I look at that and I think about the fact that I'm regarded as an explicit communicator, I certainly don't want to be regarded as impolite or aggressive or dominant, certainly not insensitive or patronizing. But the reality is that those can be some of the perceptions that implicit communicators may have of me, despite my best intentions. And if we go to the right-hand side, Luke, and we ask the question in the reverse. So here we're asking, how do you, as an explicit communicator, perceive the implicit communicators? Let's have a look at that. And you can see if we do the qualitative coding, ambiguous, unclear, vague, evasive, indirect, disconnected. And one of them there says incompetent. So it's interesting how we have these perceptions of the other, and recognizing that your communication style will be perceived by others in a particular way. And there is a very strong cultural lens that drives that. I want to pick up on what George has said earlier, that if you do have that ability to adapt and to adjust your communication style, depending on what is at stake and what's being communicated and the level of relationship, that's incredibly powerful. However, for most of us, there are these underlying lenses of unconscious bias that we use when we communicate with others. Okay, let's leave that there. If you're still busy with the population of that, that's fine. You'll be able to work on that in the background. But I'm going to ask Luke to play a video now, which really gets us some insight into this notion of the relationship between culture and communication. Let's run that now, please, Luke.
together for several years. And although Sam is the manager of the research and development team, Louise and she have a great working relationship. They are really good at bouncing ideas off each other and are collectively responsible for some seriously important innovations that have come to market in the past 12 months. Their success is largely the cause of their most recent problem. Sam successfully made a case to increase the team, but Chris just isn't working out. Chris is new to the organization but has a great reputation from their previous company. Unfortunately, Chris is sulking. In one-to-ones, they complain that both Sam and Louise keep interrupting them or talking over them. They never get the chance to add their thoughts to the conversation. Sam asks them if they feel that their English isn't strong enough, but Chris rejects that outright. It may be a second language, but they've been working in English for 15 years. Sam is a good manager and wants to help Chris fit in. She asks Louise if she's noticed anything. Louise replies that Chris never seems to have anything to say. They sit quietly in meetings, listening intently, but when there's a question put to them, they don't reply. Louise says she always feels the need to add another comment so that Chris doesn't feel too much pressure. The silence is embarrassing. She doesn't think that she's ever actually interrupted Chris, but she's not going to wait ages for an answer that may never come.
Thanks, Luke. So you may have missed the first 10 or 15 seconds in terms of context. I hope that you got that. But I think that as you listen to that video, clearly in terms of Louise and Chris and Sam, there are some dynamics at play, part of which could be explained by the explicit, implicit dynamic. So I'm going to ask Luke just to post another question for us in chat. As you think about the scenario that was painted there, what's going on here? Who in this conversation is more explicit? Who is more implicit? And what are the consequences of those differences? Go ahead and give me your answers in chat, and we'll bounce off those once we've got that. Thanks, Tina. Of course, what we don't want to do is reinforce any stereotypes about any geography, but I understand where you're coming from, Tina. Certainly when we look at the finished profile, there may be some reasons for you drawing those conclusions. Thanks, Liliana. So comments there about Louis and Chris. And Christine saying something similar. Florence is saying the same thing. Alexander, Habib. Okay, yeah. So I think it can be helpful not to be simplistic about this. We can see that there are some underlying lenses that Louise and Sam and Chris are using, which may explain something of the misunderstanding. And of course, Andy asks the million-dollar question. What's the trick to get Chris to express Chris's thoughts? And I think that's really what we've got to try and unpack over the remaining 40 minutes, Andy, that we have together. And maybe you have some thoughts as we think about that, because the one thing that struck me was that silence may well help Tina, but it can also be painful when you have this radio silence and people aren't speaking up. And I know that as I've worked with many cultures around the world, the mistake we would make is to assume that that silence means consent. Okay, so we'll keep Andy's question in the back of the mind, and let's see if by the end of this together we can come up with some answers. And Andy, maybe you have some thoughts too as we go. So let's move on to the next slide. And in that next slide, if we can go there, Luke, I would like us to think about a couple of important questions. The first question has to do with your ability to understand different communication interplays, if you like. And what you'll see on the screen here are three examples. The first one is an example of something that we call the ordered type of communication. So this one here is really where when you watch or listen to people from an ordered culture, if we talk about colors, the person speaking on the top will have something to contribute. They will then stop. There will be a pause, and the person represented by the color underneath there will then come in and fill that space while the first person listens. They will then pause, and the first person will then respond. And so you have this interplay of contribution, pause, reciprocation, pause, and so on. It's very ordered. There is that sense of speaking in between, and there's a sense of, understanding and listening, although that may not always be the case. In the second style of communication, which we do see in certain geographies, we do see in certain personalities, and we don't necessarily want to draw a hard line between where you come from and the fact that you will always be overlapping, although we do see some tendencies, is a very different way of communication. What this looks like from the outside is that both parties are speaking and listening at the same time. In fact, if you look at the lines, you will see that there are not those neat, ordered interplays. In fact, person A is speaking over person B as they work through this. And of course, if you're not used to that, it can sound rude. It can sound, are you actually listening to me? It can sound, have you heard me? If you're reasoning from an ordered perspective. If that's part of your natural communication style, then you will see that, of course, that's just perfectly normal that people would do that. So ordered, overlapping. The third one is this pause piece. So David, this piece is not necessarily specifically in my book, but I do have a section on leadership communication where we talk about some other principles. The third one is this notion of pause. So what happens here is person A will speak and there will be an extended silence. And then person B will speak and there will be an extended silence. And both parties are very comfortable with holding the space. Now, what I find is that if you're from a communication style that's more ordered or overlapping, the temptation to want to fill those spaces and to fill those pauses and to not be comfortable with that silence is a real pressing need. Of course, the reverse is also true. If you're somebody who uses a more paused type of approach, then you will be confused by this need to pick up the moment the other person has finished speaking in the ordered approach, or to continue running with your train of thought while the other person is still communicating. So I think what's important is to understand there are these turn-taking options. And what I'd like you to think about is, of course, Alexander, as somebody who's taught negotiation around the world, silence can also encourage the other party to say more. So that's very powerful. And of course, going back to what George said earlier, this is only the verbal piece. It doesn't take into consideration what we've said about the nonverbal. But as you think about this intuitively, what is your default? Do you find that you are more ordered in your preference? Do you find that you are more overlapping, or do you find that you are more paused? So if you can give us your thoughts there in chat, Luke has posted the question, how would you describe your preferred style? Go ahead and give me your insights there. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Annette. Thank you, Hisayo. So we've got some overlapping, we've got some ordered, we've got some tendencies, and we've got Stacy there talking about paused, which is interesting. Okay. And then Natalia is saying, I am more overlapping, but I'd like to be more ordered. Yeah. And I think, Natalia, the key to this whole thing is it starts with that self-awareness of how do I show up? How am I perceived? And maybe, Stacy, to your point, or Natalia, to your point, the overlapping may well work within the cultural context or the conversational style that you find yourself. And now that you're being exposed to other parts of the planet, it may be more important to adapt. So the key thing here is the value of difference, but understanding in terms of this rhythm that it's not just what you say, but how you say it. And recognizing that it may be important to hold the space. It may be important to get a little bit more rhythm into the conversation. It may be important to understand the dynamics and disadvantages of any of these. Alexander makes the point that the issue of the overlapping becomes more present in the times of Teams and Zoom, where we did not see each other face to face. And I think, Alexander, I'll add to that, that where you've got a pretty shaky connection and there's some delay, that you may not even be intentionally overlapping, but find yourself interrupting from an ongoing basis. I know when I was doing some virtual coaching a couple of years ago, one of my supervisors said to me, Andy, you seem to be interrupting a lot. And I've always tried to hold that space. And what we realized was that by the time I was giving feedback, they were onto something else. And so it felt like it was overlapping, although it wasn't intended to. So that's great. Okay, so let's go back into Mural. We want your participation again, and I think by now you know how this works. So another link, and on this link, what we're looking for is essentially the value of difference. How can we unlock the value of these different communication styles? So what you see here are two teams. Here's a team member on the left who is highly explicit, and you can see that the rest of the team is more implicit. So let's start and focus on the left-hand side there. Where you've got a majority of implicit team members, how would this singular explicit style, somebody who's very much on the left, add value to this implicit team? So go ahead and give me your thoughts. Remember, we're looking for you to double click on the sticky note, and I can see from the feedback that most of you have got it already. So we'll go to the right-hand side in a moment, but let's think about you now are the explicit team member, and how can that communication style help when the majority of the team is in fact implicit? Go ahead. Okay, thanks, Luke, for zooming us right in there. So what we're seeing is they could take on the role as the presenter. There's somebody that's providing clarity and focus and awareness and defining the subject matter and eliciting feedback and bringing more transparency and expediting the decision making and the innovation and helping to really focus in on what matters. I think that's certainly true. So we don't want to paint the explicit communicators, thank goodness, put my hand up there, as being, completely problematic. In fact, there's huge value, there's huge gift in being an explicit communicator. We certainly don't want to pathologize that communication style. But let's go across to the right-hand side and let's ask the question in the reverse. What you'll see in this team, if you just scroll up to the top there, Luke, you can see the data point. So now you've got that singular implicit communicator on the right-hand side, and the majority of the team is more towards the explicit. So how can this implicit communicator help when you've got a high percentage of the team that tends to be more explicit? Most of you already gone there. That's great. The speed is excellent, but I'll give you a few more moments just to populate your thoughts onto the mural. All right, let's have a look. So there is an ability to avoid conflict. There's a higher level of diplomacy that's come through a few times. There's this ability to pause to allow people to digest all the details, for reflection, for the double check, think twice. I like that. Um, there is the opportunity to require more participation, to offer different perspectives, and to mitigate conflict. So we can see again that where you've got that more implicit approach, it can be incredibly powerful. And certainly we don't want to suggest that in any way that's something that doesn't add value and gift in the team. The key message in terms of reading between the lines in this masterclass is understanding that all of us will be somewhere along that continuum. Yes, as George said earlier, it may be contextual, it may be issue related, but there will be that underlying tendency that we have, and being able to know that about yourself and your audience can be hugely helpful. Okay, so let's come out of that and let's go back into the slides, Luke, if we can, And if we can go to the next slide, what I want you to see on this piece is a real understanding of the different types of communication. If you were to ask me to give you some principles of communication, whether we're talking verbal or written, I would say that whether you're implicit or explicit, you would want your communication to be clear. You would want it to be concise. There's nothing worse than information overload. You would want it to be correct in terms of your facts, in terms of your data. And you would want your communication to be as complete as possible within the timeframes. If you're dealing with something that is a reputational crisis, I've spent quite a lot of time working in the corporate communication field. You want to make sure that you give your audience and your stakeholders as complete a record of the situation as you can. Now, can you think of any other, let's work with the alliteration. Can you think of any other C's that you might want to put in there? Luke's asking for a fifth C, but maybe you have a sixth or a seventh or an eighth. So let's stretch the brains. Alexandria says creative. The communication should be creative. I love that. Tina says it should be compact. I think that's very helpful. What else can you come up with, team? Consistent, Julia, absolutely consistent in terms of body language, so that what I'm saying verbally is consistent with what I'm saying non-verbally. Calculated, Irene, so I'm thinking about the risk of saying something, the risk of not saying something. I've got to come across as confident, Alexander, and Andy makes the point that it's got to be coherent. I'm hoping, Andy, that this is starting to give you some insight into how we answer your question. Florence, it needs to be charitable. That's a great one. So there's got to be a sense of compassion in there, a sense of empathy, a sense of real understanding. It needs to be courteous. Alexander's come up with a great one there. The communication needs to be catalytic. If we're looking to motivate people and inspire a group of stakeholders, how do we bring about a message in a way that's going to really end up with a catalytic approach to driving a vision and driving a new way of thinking? Now, to do that, I think what's important, as Luke just brings up the next animation for us, that one of the things that you need to understand in your communication is there is, of course, on the top to bottom, so on the y-axis, we've got spoken and written. So that's an important distinction. So the medium, am I speaking to you or am I writing to you? And what we're seeing in virtual teams is there is a big move from spoken to written. Why? If I'm in a different time zone, it's impossible for me to have you on every call. And that's why you'll see on the x-axis, we've also interplayed in this 2x2 matrix, the simultaneous or the synchronous with the asynchronous. And what you're seeing very often is that there is a move from the simultaneous spoken, which is what we would do if we were in a face-to-face meeting, to the asynchronous written into that top right-hand corner. That's often when you've got multiple time zones, or you are handing over a piece of work to another team. And so what we find is that there's been a big move towards the SharePoint, towards the wiki, towards the Slack, or towards the Trello, where somebody else can pick up that message and continue with the action. The problem, of course, is the more asynchronous your message and the more written that message, the greater the risk is that you lose meaning and tonality and intent. Because when you read my CC'd email, it may not carry the same level of conviction or empathy or insight that you would have had in that simultaneous and spoken piece, if we go down to the bottom left here. So that's a really important consideration. The world of work is forcing us into the top right-hand corner, and that is to be understood. However, it may well be that there are times that, for example, it's very difficult, almost impossible, to do conflict resolution over WhatsApp. It's always going to be easier to have that one-on-one meeting or that one-on-one video call. And we know that sometimes the ability to see each other on video is far more powerful than just relying on voice. And as Andy says, that asynchronous requires patience and it requires flexibility, which I often don't have, Andy. That's the problem. I need to get this message out. It's urgent. I want the feedback. I don't feel that I've got the time to really spend doing all of that written piece. and maybe I'm not as flexible as I should be. So that's exactly it, that when you're working in this ability to read between the lines, those two distinctions, does this message work better verbally, spoken, or written, or maybe both? And is it something that needs to be done simultaneously and in real time? We call that synchronous communication. Or can it be done asynchronously, also spoken? Maybe the voice note or the webinar or something else that you can pick up. Do I need to be in this meeting? Can the meeting be recorded? Can I pick up my piece later? Can I pre-record a piece? So all of these questions around how we communicate, I think, impacts on the way that we work and the way that we hold meetings and the way that we conduct ourselves. Now, what I'd like you to think about is the following question. How is working in a hybrid context impacting on your communication, and how is it making communication harder? I've alluded to some of that already. Maybe you have some thoughts. Please give me your insights in chat. And that, of course, this is critical, this discussion in multiple channels at the same time. So somebody will send me an email and then they'll ping me on WhatsApp and say, please check your email, or vice versa. Tina, the fact that although we've now cut back on travel time and we should have all of this breathing space, what's happening is we're not getting those water cooler coffee break moments and the informal chat. But as Andy said, if you're clever, you've got far more options in terms of what you say, how you say it, when you say it. Stacey makes the point that there can be that challenge of people inferring tone. And of course, Eva, the most frustrating noise in my life is that WhatsApp notification alert. In my ideal world, all notifications would be on mute. My family knows it's one of my pet peeves when we're sitting around the table and we seem to be competing with each other on who can get the most notifications in 5 minutes. The misunderstandings, Hugo, can be far greater than when we're face to face. And of course, as Florence said, it's difficult to avoid the interruptions. When you're on a video call, I think what you're saying is in a video call, you're more focused. I'm reading that as a positive, Florence, although again, you can see I'm possibly misinterpreting what you're saying there. Natalia makes the point that when we have people online and in person in the same meeting, that can be a huge challenge. And I would just say on that one, Natalia, when you're having that kind of meeting, it's always best to have a ground rule in place that everybody dials in on their own PC or their own computer. Otherwise, you have a very different balance of power and communication. Nils makes the point that communication is clear with less chance of misinterpretation with synchronous comms, and single channel communication leaves too much to interpret. I think those are very powerful insights. And Hisayo makes the point, of course, that texts can be misunderstanding. So let's leave it there unless you have any other questions. But the point I wanted to give you on this is reading between the lines is also about reading spoken versus written, and also recognizing that balance between synchronous or simultaneous and asynchronous. And there is this push for us to move into that top right-hand corner. Alexander makes the point that the respect to the other person by laying the phone on the table speaks for itself. The same for meetings, people typing in laptops rather than listening. The pause is a quiet tool to get back attention. Alexander, exactly. I think the moment I'm in a meeting and somebody puts that phone in front of me, it already says that the message or the anticipated call is at least equal, if not more important than this time that I'm giving them. So that can send a very often unsettled message in and of itself. That may not be what your intention, but to Alexander's point, that's exactly what can come through. Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes left. Let me pause at this point and just see if you have any questions or comments or observations about anything that we've said up to this point. And Andy, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts to the question you posed earlier as to how we deal with a more implicit communicator. Maybe you want to post some thoughts there. If not, we'll get out of this and we'll go to, if we can, Luke, to the next slide. Okay, just checking if there are any comments or feedback? Okay, there is another question that I want to ask you to just put into chat for us, Luke, and it's this notion of in chat, what works best for you? What do you do to make sure that the virtual communication is successful? So let's go back to that slide just to remind you again of what those examples were. So here we're thinking about simultaneous, spoken, written, asynchronous, spoken, written. What do you find? And I know that you'll be tempted to say, well, it depends, but think about context. Think about where you have found that ability in terms of the rhythm of communication. It's just not practical to get everybody on every call into a video, although that may be certainly what you would desire. So what have you found? Yeah, absolutely. Took makes the point, turning on your camera, hugely beneficial, although not always appropriate, not always possible, but certainly something you'd want to set up as a ground rule if you can. I know that I've been in a couple of teams where we may well have mute on, but we'll have cameras open. We'll feel as if we're in the same room, although we're not, and we can just reach out and ping somebody when we want to chat. And we've been experimenting that even at Country Navigator in our Teams meetings. Annette makes the point that in negotiation, the asynchronous is very powerful, and I would agree with that. Amani makes the point that we should be asking for feedback and follow-up. Eva makes the point that having the ground rules, the rules of engagement early on, raised hand, mute, all things that are really important. And I must confess, I took for granted today on this session, but you're absolutely right. A brief check-in, checking in, that's two of you that have mentioned that, Julia and Victor. And Liliana makes the point of starting the meeting with a person using video can really help. The slides, David, lots of questions, Tina, and of course, Stacey makes the point underlying all of this that we need to hold this space by being respectful and inclusive. Alexander talks about splitting the audience between the receiver and the recipients and the sender, the written message. You might be a busy manager who needs short, precise communication. The experts might need more detail. And thank you, Alexander. The CC and the BCC must be the absolute bane of my life, second only, Alexander, to the reply to all. But that's another webinar for another day. Okay, Hugo makes the point, as I said earlier, the value of recording the call can certainly help. Okay, so as we come out of this one, let's go back to the next slide if we can, and let's think about how communication works better. And to do that, I'm going to ask Luke to play this next video for us as we begin to think about improving our communication. So please let's run that now, Luke.
Hi, I'm a senior performance development coach at Country Navigator, and I want to talk to you about culturally intelligent communication. Now, let's start off by asking you a couple of challenging questions. Do you understand everything you hear? Do you understand everything you say? Are you sure? Do you understand even a simple phrase like quite good? Now, if your manager says your work this month has been quite good, but could do with a little bit more effort on your behalf, quite good here means not very good. And another manager might say, your work this month has been quite good. Keep up the effort. And in this case, quite good means excellent. The dictionary will tell you that quite good means acceptable, average, unremarkable. But where is truth? Now, this is a simple phrase that is not actually that important. What about important words and concepts that are central to an effective organization? A culturally intelligent communicator can start to unpick the meaning between the words said. The explicit versus implicit style of communication is a key factor in understanding culture. For an explicit communicator, the gap between words is less important. They give you the specific words that they want you to understand and rarely leave room for interpretation. They can seem rude or overly direct or even confrontational. However, at the extreme end of the dimension, you get what you hear. For an implicit communicator, the gaps between words are where real meaning is found. Non-verbal cues, context, shared references, and hints suggest an interpretation, which the careful listener will pick up on. Now, people who communicate implicitly can seem vague and indecisive, and in some cases, even deceitful. And after all, rather than saying no, they may hide the refusal in the middle of something that quite looks like an agreement on the surface. Consider this simple example. Wei Wei is under a lot of pressure and has an extremely high workload. He's a marketing manager and is leading the regional rollout on a new product launch. Angela, his counterpart in the APAC region, has asked if he could possibly second one of his team to her. Now, they are launching the week before Wei Wei's North American region. Wei Wei replied, "Of course it's possible to second Alex to you, but it will cause some discomfort to my team." Angela, an explicit communicator, is not sure whether Wei Wei is agreeing to help her out or not. Now, Wei Wei, an implicit communicator, thinks that he's been very clear and that he has said he cannot second Alex to APAC, and is irritated when Angela puts him on the spot and asks him directly, "Well, is that a yes or a no?" Their lack of cultural intelligent communication has not only caused frustration to two people, it has also added a couple of extra emails and distracted them both from what they are doing. Let me talk to you about a couple of suggestions which could transform the way that you communicate and become more culturally intelligent. Firstly, you must identify your preferred style. So either look at your world prism or ask your friends and colleagues to help you. Are you direct? Are you open, specific, and concise? Or are you indirect, imprecise, subtle, and quiet? And if someone tells you that they are quite warm, do you agree with them, explicit, or get up and open the window, implicit? You can use the same kind of measure to identify how others communicate. And to do that, you need our second tip. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So we should listen more than we actually speak. Listen carefully to what people say and also consider how they say it. Look for the meaning between the words. Consider what is left unsaid and try to work out whether you need to take the words at face value or you need to dig deeper. Open questions are an excellent way to engage someone in conversation and learn more about them and their communication style. What, when, where, how, why? Encourage conversation and invite others to share more. Closed questions, do you, do they, etc., confirm, clarify, and conclude conversations. Questioning skills are an important way to build inclusion. Questions demonstrate interest and give value to a person. But questions also help others share their ideas, and in sharing, feel part of the team. Finally, remember that non-communication is also communication. Silence is not only golden, it's also full of meaning and value. So ask yourself, what does this silence mean? Don't rush to fill it in. Silence gives others the opportunity to explain themselves or encourages quieter, more reflective thinkers to offer their opinion. In a negotiation, a silence gives the other side the opportunity to offer a concession.
So there we go, learning your own style and looking to identify other people's styles, considering what is said, how it's said, and what is not said, asking more questions, and checking the silence. As we come to the end of this presentation, I want to go back to the question that Andy asked about Chris in that earlier scenario. Any thoughts on getting Chris, an implicit communicator, to share thoughts more directly? Any ideas based on what we've spoken about today and based on our interactions over the last 50 minutes or so? Give me your ideas in chat. Okay, while you're doing that, Luke, if we can just advance to the next slide, just want to make the point that this is part of a learning path. So you can get into that learning path and you'll see that there are resources, videos, there's the World Prism profile. There are things that you can look at in terms of a more comprehensive approach above and beyond this masterclass. And we'd like you to send an email to support@countrynavigator.com to get access to that learning path, you'd be most welcome. I'm just scanning through the feedback that you've given us. Andy, I hope this is giving you some insights. I'm not going to read all of it. Asking questions, asking, would you like to add something? Guidance, patience, giving room for pausing. I think that's all very, very powerful. Well, team, we've managed to get about 5 minutes back. As we move to the final slide, all that's left for me to do is to, first of all, thank my producer, Luke, as always, for co-piloting with me, to thank you for your attention, participation, and interaction, and to wish you well as you continue your leadership journey and reading between the lines. Until next time, from me, Andy Bruff, bye-bye.